In Part 5, we will create a custom dashboard form to display reporting data about expense claims. The form will contain reporting controls to show the number of expense claims and average duration for them graphically, as well as two lists, one showing expense claims awaiting approval and the other showing expense claims awaiting processing. Then, towards the end, we will expose this dashboard form on a SharePoint Webpart page and link to it from the SharePoint Quick Launch menu for the site. Welcome to Step 24. In this step, we will create a new read-only list view to display expense claim information. This view will eventually be used on the custom expense claim dashboard form to show expense claims awaiting approval and expense claims awaiting processing. If you're not already in the K2 Application Elements page for the expense claim list, open up the expense claim list for your SharePoint site, and then from the List tab menu at the top of the page, click on the K2 Application option, and I'll give you a few seconds to load that up. Okay, once your page loads up to the Application Elements screen, from this screen select the New option in the menu at the top, and then click View. The view that we're going to create in this step will actually be used twice in our final dashboard form. The primary purpose will be to basically show expense claims sitting in one of the user task events in our workflow. We'll drop it on that form to show a listing of expense claims awaiting approval by the initial assigned approver, and then we'll also drop another instance on that form to display expense claims awaiting processing by the finance team. Once your form loads up, let's configure the general screen for this new view as follows. Name it Expense Claim List, and then put in a description that just says Read-Only List of Expense Claims. For the category option, you can leave the default set. For view type, select List View. The Expense Claim Smart Object should already be selected, but if it is not, you can use the Browse button to locate and select this Expense Claim Smart Object. For the list method, use getListItems. It should be the default method that's already selected. And then for call this method when the form loads, make sure that's not checked. We do not want the list item to populate automatically whenever it is open. We will actually have a rule that will populate this list view later on when we set that up. Now, over on the layout screen, you can move over there, select the Create Labels and Controls link. And when that dialog window loads up, you can select the following fields: Title, Requester, the Value field, Approver Value field, Submit Date, and Total Amount. And once you've selected all of those, you can click OK. Now we need to make a couple cosmetic changes to this list view here in the case of the Requester and Approver columns. Just to tidy it up a little, we actually want to remove the value text from the header of each of these columns. We will also change the width of a few of the columns in this view and then add in a sum aggregation to show a total amount for the total amount column. First, select the Requester Value column, and then over here on the right, select the Header tab of the Properties pane, and change the text property to just say Requester. And then let's do the same thing with the Approver column. Select that column, and then over in the Header tab of the Properties pane, remove the text Value so that it just says Approver. And then we want to adjust the width of the column so that the title column is the widest, and then configure the Submit Date and the Total Amount columns to be a little bit smaller as shown here. This may take a little bit of time to play around with, but once you're ready, select the Total Amount column, and then over here on the right, select the Column tab, and click the Sum Aggregation to add a sum total for the total amount. That's all we need to do on this view, so click Finish to return to the K2 Application Elements screen. A quick review here. Basically in this step, all we did was created a read-only list view for expense claims. We're going to use this view on the dashboard form in a later step. In step 25, we will create a view that will contain two reporting controls. Then later on, we will actually use this view on the dashboard form. For the purposes of this application, we want to show the number of expense claims submitted over the preceding 60 days and the average processing time for those claims. Starting back on the Application Elements screen, add a new view to your application. I want to demonstrate in this step how you can use various K2 reporting controls to customize a report view for your users, managers, and administrators of your applications. In this step, we'll drop 2 instances of the duration chart that K2 makes available to us onto the view, and then we'll configure it to show number of claims submitted and average duration of those claims. Switch over to the General page and configure the view with the following settings. For name, you can name it Expense Claim Reports. For description, enter in Contains report controls for expense claims. For category, you can leave the default value, you don't need to change it. For view type, select Item View. And for data source, you can delete the entry that's in there and leave it blank. Then move on to the Layout screen where we will configure the table layout for where these controls will fit. You can click the Layout Table Only link and add a layout table with 1 column and 2 rows. Then from the Controls toolbox over on the right, drag and drop 2 workflow duration chart controls into each of the rows of the table so that one is on top of the other. Now select the top chart on the view and configure the properties for this one as follows. Any properties that I don't mention you can leave set to its default value. So for the name of this chart, name it Chart Instances. For title, enter in number of claims submitted. To set the workflow name, use the ellipses button next to this field and select the Expense Claim Workflow. Doing this will only show the expense claim workflow items in this report. For status, set it to All. For range, set it to last 60 days because we're only going to show the data for the last 60 days. Group by you can set to weekly. And for display value, you can set it to instance count. This will show the number of instances of the workflow that were started. Now select the lower chart on the view and configure the properties here as follows. Also, again, if I don't mention one of the properties, consider it to be left as a default. For this chart's name, you can call it Chart Duration. And then for the text field, put in Average Duration. And then again, use the ellipses button in the Workflow Names field to select the Expense Claim Workflow. We're only going to use instances of that workflow in this chart. Then move on to the Status field where you can set that to All. For range, again set last 60 days. Group by, you can set to weekly. And this time for display value, set it to duration. This will show the average duration of all workflows in this category. We should be all set with that chart, so now move over to the rule screen of the view. Here we want to double check to make sure that the rules were added to load up the values and data in each of these charts. So here, edit the rule called When the View Executed Initialize. Then over in the rule actions, we should see 2 actions that call the run chart method for the 2 reporting controls that we just added. Let's configure each of these rules to run in a batch by clicking the Then link and select the word Also for both of these actions. Once you've done that, your rules should look like mine. From here, you can click OK to close the rule designer and finish the form designer. Now that we've completed that step, what we've basically done is created a view that contains 2 control charts that will show some of the metrics of our application, and it will be graphical in nature. At this point, we've created all the views that are necessary for this report. So in step 26, we're actually going to create a form that will be the container for these views that we just created. You should be in the Application Elements section for the expense claim list. In step 26, we're going to add a new form to this application by selecting New from the menu at the top, and then select the Form option. We will use this form to be a container for the views that we just created, and design this with management and users in mind. The goal here is to demonstrate how you can quickly build metrics-based views down into your K2 applications to help you tell the story as your application runs and justify its existence. Open up the General menu option once your page loads, and we'll give this new form a name. You can enter in Expense Claim Dashboard, and for description, put in Dashboard View of Expense Claims, and you can leave the category option set to the default value. Now let's move over to the Layout section where we'll drop the views onto the form. Once you reach the Layout section, on the left side of the page, open up the Recent Items group of views, and then locate the Expense Claim Reports view. You can drag an instance of this view right onto the form, and since this view contains charts showing averages, let's rename it to Average Instances and Duration. You can do this by clicking in the upper left corner where the view title is. Now let's drag two instances of the Expense Claim List view onto the form. Since my screen is a little bit smaller here to maintain readability in the video, I'm going to pause the video for a few seconds while I do this. I have these views in place now, so make sure that these two at the bottom are side by side. Let's name the first one Expense Claims Awaiting Approval, and then we'll name the second one Expense Claims Awaiting Processing. We have a pretty good organization of these views now, so remember, K2 also has the ability to apply different themes to your forms out of the box. Let's take a moment here to configure the theme of this form so that it blends well with SharePoint. In this task, select the form anywhere in the white space outside of the views, and then over in the Properties section for the form theme, you can select SharePoint 2013. Now let's set up a rule so that the form calls the list method for each of the list views and passes in a filter to only show the relevant items for the view. Let's skip over to the rule screen and edit the rule when the form is initializing. To get the data that we want in each of these views, we need to add the Execute a View method action to this rule 2 times, and then set the first one in the list to call the GetListItems method of the expense claim list for expenses that are awaiting approval, and then set up the second action so that it calls the GetListItems method for the expense claim list that's tied to claims awaiting processing. Finally, we also want to change each of these actions so that they run as a batch. So you can select the word then and change it to the word also for each of these actions. To filter these views accordingly, we also need to configure the GetList method with input parameters for the status column. Click on the Configure link to set up the GetListItems method of the expense claims awaiting approval list view. When your page loads up to the input mapping screen, enter in the word submitted for the status column, and then click Finish. Now select the Configure link to set up the GetListItems method of the expense claims awaiting processing. And just like we did in the previous task, on the input mapping screen, type the word Approved for the status column, and click Finish when you're done. At this point, you can also click OK to close the Rule Designer, and then click Finish to close the Form Design canvas. A quick review for step 26. In this step, we created the form that's going to host the reporting views. We configured this form to call the list method for each of these list views, and then we set it up so that the list views will only show submitted or approved expense claims. In step 27, we're going to add a Webpart page into our SharePoint site, and then use the K2 Form Viewer app to display the dashboard form we just created. We will also create a navigational shortcut on the Quick Launch menu so that users can access the dashboard easily. K2 provides us with a Form Viewer app part that makes it easy to expose a SmartForm inside a SharePoint Webpart page. Let's set up a new Webpart page for our users and management and configure it to show the report dashboard form that we just created. Then we'll make it easy to access by adding a link to it right on the Quick Launch bar here on the left side of the page. Return to the landing page of your SharePoint site, and then go into the Site Contents section and open up Site Pages. This is a wiki library actually, so I'll just select New Wiki Page to add a page to the site. And set the name for this new page to Expense Claim Dashboard with no spaces, and then click Create. When you get your page opened up in edit mode, select the Insert tab, and then click the App Part ribbon button. Then add a K2 Form Viewer app part to the page's rich content. Once this drops in, we need to tell the app part which K2 form to load up. And luckily, K2 makes this easy to do within the configuration of the app part. When the form viewer finishes loading, you can locate and select the Expense Claim Dashboard form. Now make a note here actually, it may take a little while for the list view to finish loading. You can also use the search box to filter the list if desired. Just filter on the Expense Claim Dashboard form. Once you've selected that form, you can click Submit. In our next task now, we want to configure some of the properties around the view of this app part as it appears on the page to our users, so that it shows the entire SmartForm from top to bottom. To do this, let's edit the app part settings by selecting the down arrow on the app part's upper right corner, and then select Edit the Web Part from the configuration menu. Set the Chrome type to None, and then set the web part height to 1000 pixels, and you may want to set the width to 1400 pixels if you want to see all the columns in the list at the bottom. It's entirely up to you. And then you can click OK. Finally, click Save in the ribbon bar up at the top of the page to complete the changes. Then the last thing we have to do is make this page easier for our users to find when they come into the SharePoint site. For this demo, we'll just add a link over in the Quick Launch menu on the left so it's readily available throughout the site. Be sure to obtain the URL of the new dashboard page by copying it from the address bar in your browser. Then if you need to, you can paste this URL into Notepad or some other text editor just in case you need to get to it later. Open up Site Settings for your site, and then select the Quick Launch option, which you can find under the Look and Feel section. Add in a new navigation link here, and then we'll configure it to point to the URL. You can paste that into the web address box. For description, I'll enter in the word Dashboard, and then click OK to save it back. From here, let's return to the site's home page. Let's click on the dashboard page here and make sure that our page loads up. And this looks pretty good. So let's do a quick review for step 27. In this step, we added a page to SharePoint and configured this page to host the Expense Claim Dashboard report form. In looking at this page, you can see that it's showing expense claims only, and there are a couple sitting in the approval queue as well as waiting for finance to process. Step 28 will be our final step in part 5 of this tutorial centered around reports for the expense claim approval application. In this step, we will check in all remaining forms and views so that they are available to all of our end users. Go back to the K2 Application Elements screen for the expense claims list at this point. Upon finishing up the last couple steps in this tutorial, you may have left a few of your forms and views set to a checked out state as you work through the tasks to configure them. This is mainly just to get you in the habit of doing this in your own environment to avoid any production issues tied to not doing this once you release your changes for an application. You can right-click on each artifact here in the list and then select Check In to close up any remaining views and forms that are still checked out to you. Once you complete that, you can return to your expense claim list in SharePoint. At this point in time, your expense claim application is complete. Feel free to walk through part 6 in the documentation of this tutorial to test your application out to make sure that it works as intended. Or if you would rather walk through a video to do this, you could actually go back over to the expense claim demonstration video, which follows the same steps once you get past the overview section of the application. This has been a pretty long and complex tutorial, But you have learned quite a lot about creating more complex applications in K2 for SharePoint and Appit that combine data, forms, workflow, and reports into cohesive applications. Among other things, you should have learned how to integrate with external data systems like web services and SQL databases by creating and using smart objects. We also learned how to create our own data storage areas using SmartBox smart objects. We learned how to build more advanced forms using K2 SmartForms with features like integrating with external systems through smart objects. We used rules with validation and actions in those forms and views. We also used conditional execution depending on a user's actions. We learned how to use expressions and aggregation using list views and editable list views. We also used form states to control the form's layout and behavior. We built header detail-based forms, in other words, master detail forms, all doing this using the browser. Now, if you also recall, we learned how to manually integrate forms with workflows as opposed to just using the automatic K2 workflow task panel to integrate these forms with workflows. And then finally, we used the reporting controls that K2 provides to build a custom report using a SmartForm at the end.